Okay, we're going to begin Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers. Moshe Kibbutz Torah Sinai. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. I mean, an obvious question is, why doesn't it say, who gave the Torah at Sinai? God himself. It should say God gave the Torah to Moshe at Sinai. Why does it say Moshe received the Torah? We don't speak about, in the most obvious way, that God's the one who gave the Torah. Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. Moshe received the Torah. What does that indicate? We once discussed, the Rambam writes that every Jew could be as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, God attests to the fact there was no one ever more humble than Moshe on the face of the earth. Moshe Rabbeinu was the most faithful servant to God. Moshe was negated to God's existence. There wasn't an iota of himself. Every aspect of his being was dedicated to God. More than Avraham Avinu. More than David. Nobody's comparable to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe is our teacher. But whatever his capacity was, the Chazal tell us, the Midrash tells us, that Moshe's soul, the dimension of Moshe's soul, was the equivalent of all the souls of Jewish people combined. The Torah had to be given to the Jewish people. The Jewish people in the entire had to receive it directly from God. But if we all stood at the mountain and we heard God speak, no one individual is receiving the Torah. Everyone is receiving his piece based on who he is. Moshe Rabbeinu being the equivalent of the entire Jewish people, embodied in one person, his being the conduit to receive the Torah on behalf of the Jewish people, that is the equivalent of the Jewish people receiving the Torah. When Moshe received the Torah. But still, it could say, God gave the Torah to Moshe. Now, as great as Moshe was, as great as anyone is, everything outside of God is finite. Moshe, he may be the equivalent of the totality of Jewish people, but he's still finite in the spiritual realm. The Torah itself is not finite. The Torah itself is infinite. The Torah being God's wisdom, as God is infinite, his wisdom is infinite. So when Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, within which context did he receive it? Within his own capacity. If we would say God gave the Torah at Sinai to Moshe, he gave it. If it's coming from God, God is unlimited. So that unlimited knowledge was communicated to Moshe. But that's not true. Moshe received it within the context of his own capacity. So even though, in terms of the words and the concepts, it may represent the infinite, but his level of comprehension was limited to his own limited capacity. Even though his capacity was something which borders on the infinite, but anything outside of God is not infinite. It's finite. So by Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, Judah the Prince, when he redacted the Mishnah, and he writes Moshe Kibbutz Torah Sinai, it's to emphasize the point, as great as Moshe was, he only received it based on his own limited capacity, which borders on the infinite. There's a question which is asked. The name Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe. Who named Moshe Moshe? His parents It's not the parents, his name his parents had given him. Moshe had very special parents. Amram was his father. Yocheved was his mother. She was the head midwife in Egypt. And she did not heed the decree of Paro to kill the males when they were born on the birth stool. Moshe had 7 names that were given to him by his parents. Tov means good. Tuvi, Tuvio. Many names he has. But the name which the Torah chooses to identify Moshe is the name that was given to him by the daughter of Paro, the woman who had drawn him out of the water. She saw this box floating. She extended her hand, retrieved it, opens the box. She sees a Jewish child crying in the box. And she names it Moshe. Why? I drew him out of the water. That's the name Moshe Rabbeinu was given by the daughter of Paro. It's interesting. She's not from the Jewish pedigree. She's an Egyptian woman. Although at the time that she took Moshe out of the box, at that moment she went down to convert to monotheism. As the Talmud tells us, that she immersed herself to cleanse herself from the idolatry of her father's household. That was the value of going down to the Nile, to immerse herself. It's like a person going to the mikveh, except this is a natural body of water, the Nile. So she said, why is his name Moshe? Because I drew him, in Hebrew, I drew him from the water. So it's interesting, the Sepharno, now, we know by the plague of the blood, Moshe Rabbeinu did not strike the Nile. Aaron struck the Nile. Why did Moshe strike the Nile? Because in truth, Moshe, when he was put into that box, he should have drowned. It was a miracle that he did not drown. So meaning God had to intervene and not allow the Nile to function as it's meant to function to save the life of Moshe Rabbeinu. Otherwise, the water would have seeped into that box, into that basket. The current would have overturned the basket. It did not, because God decreed it should not. So due to God's intervention, the Nile did not drown Moshe Rabbeinu. If Moshe Rabbeinu would have hit the Nile, it would have been the action of an ingrate. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu did not hit the Nile at the plague of blood. Rather, it was Aaron. Aaron, not being the beneficiary of the Nile, he's the one who actually carried out the order. He struck the Nile. But when Bas Paro, the daughter of Paro, her name was Basya, Basko, the daughter of God, that was the name she was given when she converted to Judaism or to monotheism, she saw something miraculous. That God allowed this child to survive. And it's within a she's seeing it through a monotheistic lens. What does that indicate? For who does God perform miracles? Since Moshe, she understood, has a mission, for that mission to be addressed, he has to live. He has to survive. That means he was drawn out of the water, not for himself. He was drawn out of the water to help others. She understood clearly that the reason why Moshe survived the Nile, that his destiny was to change the world. Just as this is something which is an impossibility, unless it's due to divine intervention, Moshe Rabbeinu is meant to what? As God helped him come out of the water, he will help others to lead them out of their morass, out of their dismal situations, to bring life to the world, to bring success and blessing to the world. That's how the Sepharno explains, that's lies named Moshe. Okay? Therefore, the Torah uses that name because that's exactly what Moshe was. That was his function. He brought the plagues. He was the Redeemer. He was chosen to be the Redeemer. He led us in the desert. He went to heaven to receive the Torah on our behalf. He gave meaning to existence, because existence was specifically created for that purpose. That's why the name Moshe is used continuously. Now, we mentioned in the past, there's a Orach Chaim HaKodesh, in his commentary writes that although we have no prophecy today, but there's one area which is prophetic. When a parent chooses a name for a child, the reason why that name is chosen, God puts that name in the minds of the parents. Because the Talmud says, based on a verse, that what lies within the name, the total destiny of that child lies within the name that is given at the time he's born. So when a parent chooses a name for whatever reason, they may have their own reason. That's the reason. The reason why the name was given and put into their minds and why they chose and favored that name was because within that name, if you're able to understand the innateness of that name, what lies in the name, it identifies the destiny of that child. Moshe Rabbeinu, his destiny was min hamayim shisou. His destiny is to be the savior for others, to be the savior for the world. That's why he was named Moshe, and that's why the Torah uses that name, Moshe. He was good, but good, a lot of people are good. Well, he's the ultimate good. But more being specific, Moshe means he was drawn out of the water for a purpose, and he was saved to save others. Therefore, that's the reason why Moshe is used, rather than any other names. Enjoy one moment, please. Hello. It's got it, Larry.
Okay, Rabbi. So earlier you talked about Moses receiving the Torah at Sinai to the extent that it was his capability to receive it, which it makes sense because
Capacity.
Capacity. Beg your pardon. So the question begs the question that maybe there's so much more to the Torah than we know because Moses got it and through the oral tradition passed it on to us. But to the extent that he was able to have capacity is what we know. There may be so much more, and there's suggestion that there probably is so much more based on it being infinite.
Okay, good question. The only being in existence that's infinite is God himself. God created the world for the sake of the Jewish people and the sake of Torah. And the proving grounds is the physical existence, to make choices. The prescription to live by as human beings is the Torah. God knows we have limitation. Of course he knows. He created us, he knows we have limitation. He gives us a Torah to address our soul, which also, because anything created is finite. But God himself, who's infinite, his wisdom is infinite. Within that knowledge, the knowledge represents infinite. That's the knowledge. We're able to comprehend it within a finite context. But what we're comprehending finite is something which is infinite. Therefore, what is the world to come? The world to come is we're able to cleave to God. So the catalyst to cleave to God, we process it within our finite context. But what are we processing, which is with a finite context, which God knows we have limitation. It's something which inherently is infinite. And because inherently it's infinite, when we study it and we're spiritualized through that, we're spiritualized through something which has infinite value. As a result of that, we establish that commonality with God, we're able to attach ourselves to him. Because the Torah itself is the catalyst which allows us to attach ourselves. So our level of understanding, of course, it's limited. And God knows it's limited. But the capacity he gave us that we have the ability, that's sufficient to absorb it, that we have relevance to the infinite, because the information we're absorbing represents the infinite. And once you're touched by the infinite, you can have a relation with the infinite. And you could attach yourself and become part of that system. I once mentioned Emet Ramchal that he writes in The Knowing God that although the human being, Moshe Rabbeinu, is finite, that although we're finite in our spiritual context, but we're able to become part of an infinite system. For instance, he says, you take a branch and you graft it onto a tree. The branch in its own right cannot produce fruit. But if you graft it appropriately and properly to the tree, eventually the ecology of the branch is the same ecology as the tree. And it starts producing why? Because what flows in the tree will flow through that branch. God is infinite. We're finite. But God gave us the means to attach ourselves, to graft ourselves onto his being. That's what their relationship is. Once we attach ourselves, although we're finite, but what flows through our spiritual vein, so to say, is infinite. We're part of an infinite system. What's the infinite system? God himself. Because God gave us something of the infinite, which is the Torah, which gives us a degree of spiritualization, which innately is infinite. Therefore, we can attach ourselves to the infinite, which is God himself. By the splitting of the sea, splitting of the Red Sea, the Torah tells us when they sang the song of the sea, they said, Zeh keli v'aveyu. This is my God, I will extol him. When you say this, so Rashi cites the Midrash, what the maidservant, lowly maidservant, saw at the sea, Yecheskel the prophet did not see. What did she see? She was able to point to the divine presence and say, this is my God. That's how palpable God's presence was. Yecheskel, it wasn't that palpable to him, although he's a prophet. When the maidservant saw what she saw at the sea, do you think she understood what she was saying? She may have seen it, but she had no inkling or didn't have the capacity to even appreciate what she was seeing. So what I said was, we say in the closing bracha of Sim Shalom, we say, Kiv or panecha nasat olanu, with the illumination of your face, referring to Sinai, Torah's chaim v'avos chesed. You gave us a living Torah and a love for loving kindness. With the light of the countenance of your face. We saw at Sinai, we prophesied the wake state. And God, we were face to face with God. What did we see? We prophesied in the wake state. God allowed us to appreciate something at a certain level. We saw something that represents infinite. We did see the infinite. I'll give you an example. We speak about the tip of an iceberg. When you see the tip of an iceberg, it's part of something so vast, but it's all below the water. And you don't realize how vast it is. Lahavdil, Elef Abdolos. When we saw at Sinai, whatever we appreciated, we saw something which is infinitesimal compared to what the reality is. Even infinitesimal is too much to speak about. But what did we see? What God allowed us to be exposed to was the infinite. Do we have a capacity to appreciate it? The answer is definitely not. But Ba'or Panech, with the illumination of your face, his face is infinite. There's an obligation 3 times a year to visit the Temple Mount. And the Torah uses the term to see the countenance of the Master God, to go to the Temple Mount, to the sanctuary, to meet the Master and see the countenance of the Master. When we see the countenance, you have a sense of the holiness of that location. But what are you seeing? You're seeing the infinite. Do you appreciate that it's infinite? No. But God says that's the reality. You're being touched by the infinite. Baruch Leibowitz, who was the closest student of Rav Chaim Soloveitch, Rav Chaim Brisker, came to New York with his son-in-law to raise money for his yeshiva in Lithuania, known as Kamenetz. He meets Jimmy Walker, and Jimmy Walker, as soon as he sees him, says, I want to give you the key to the city. We're going to set up grandstands in City Hall with bands and speakers, and you're going to be sitting on the dais, and I will speak. Because, of course, he didn't speak English. He was like overwhelmed when he met this great rabbi. And he gets up at the ceremony and he says, and I mentioned this in the past, says, you see this rabbi? He's a refutation on the Darwinian theory. Nobody could ever say that this man comes from the ape. He's a refutation. Okay? That was a statement. Let me ask you, do you think Jimmy Walker had an understanding of what this great holy rabbi was? He had no understanding what he was. But one thing he knew, he never met such a person in his life before, and he was touched by whatever it is. It was an aura. This aura doesn't emanate from an ape, where the origin is a monkey or chimpanzee, whatever you want to call it. But what is it? I don't know, but I know it's something out of the ordinary. And it's a reputation. Therefore, he will be the citizen of the city who received the key to the city. Same idea. We're exposed to certain things. We're not able to process it. It's beyond our capacity. But we're touched. By what are we touched? We're touched by the infinite. And the more you have relevance to that, the more you have a sense that it is the infinite, although you cannot fathom what infinite is, because within limitation, you can't go beyond limitation.